If you only read the reports from official sources, you might be forgiven for thinking it was a work of great humanitarianism. In the dusty, remote town of Amdaras in Chad, a gleaming hospital complex has sprung up, said to treat 80 patients a day, nearly all of them refugees from the brutal civil conflict shaking Sudan. Entirely funded by the United Arab Emirates, the field hospital is seemingly just one part of a major operation underway to make life bearable for those affected by the war. The New York Times reports on PR videos which show, quoting, Emirati officials dropping aid packages outside straw huts in nearby villages, donating goats and renovating schools. They have even organized a camel race. Yet these pictures really only tell half the story, because there's another side to the Abdaras Field Hospital, a darker aspect that paints Abu Dhabi in a far from flattering light. According to a report by a UN panel of experts, one backed up by anonymous American, African, and European officials, the hospital is not there to treat patients. Rather, it is there to act as cover for an Emirati attempt to ship as many weapons into Sudan as possible, to tool up Abu Dhabi's allies with expensive kit, even as they commit mass atrocities. Such accusations are, of course, denied by UAE officials who say their intentions are purely humanitarian, but that hasn't stopped critics from claiming that the hospital is just one part of a concerted push to decide Sudan's fate, even if that means prolonging one of the worst wars currently taking place on Earth. Because, make no mistake, Sudan's civil conflict is brutal. Breaking out in April of 2023, it pits regular Sudanese armed forces of General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan against the paramilitary rapid support forces of a warlord known as Hemeti. So bad has the fighting become that the capital of Khartoum lies in ruin while the nation's agricultural land has been devastated. But it's when you look at the stats that you really begin to see how bad the conflict is. With nearly 10 million people displaced by the fighting, Sudan ranks as the worst refugee crisis in the world. The Economist notes that 1 in 8 of the world's internally displaced people are in Sudan. Meanwhile, the UN's official famine monitoring body estimates that 750,000 are on the brink of starvation, including in the capital. To the west in Darfur, ethnic killings by Hemeti's RSF recall some of history's darkest moments. In the city of El Janina, between 10,000 and 15,000 are thought to have been slaughtered in less than a week. And speaking of deaths, the official toll for the war stands at 17,000, but everybody accepts that this is a massive undercount. American intelligence, for instance, estimates that over 150,000 have died in just 15 months. If confirmed, that would make the current Sudanese civil war far deadlier than the conflict in Gaza. The destruction, too, is on another scale. Sudan expert Alex Dawal has written of how, quoting him here, RSF fighters operate like human locusts, stripping cities and countryside bare of all movable resources. The remarkable thing? When the war erupted in spring of 2023, nobody thought it was going to be like this. With the SAF holding a military advantage, most observers expected a quick, nasty fight that would cause chaos and death in Khartoum, but be over relatively quickly. The fact this didn't happen is down to one thing: interference by outside actors. As far back as June of 2023, foreign policy was warning that Sudan's conflict was morphing into a proxy war, pulling in powers from not just Africa, but also the Middle East and Europe. Locally, the independent outlet Sudan War Monitor has pointed the finger at Libya and the Central African Republic, from where the remnants of the Wagner Group have funneled arms and fuel to RSF forces. The Institute for Security Studies, by contrast, casts the net much wider, reporting that Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia all seem to be backing the SAF. Yet despite the staggering number of nations trying to meddle in Sudan, a total that even includes Ukraine after Kiev deployed special forces there to fight Wagner, there is one nation that seems involved in the conflict above all others. According to The Guardian, quoting here, the United Arab Emirates is the foreign player most invested in the war. In fact, without its direct and all-around support, the RSF would not have been able to wage war to the same extent. The quote ends. This is opinion also held by former CIA analyst and Sudan expert Cameron Hudson, who told The Times, quoting here, the Emirates has done more than anyone else to sustain the RSF and to prolong the conflict in Sudan. If that's the case, then the obvious questions are how and why. After all, it's not like Abu Dhabi would be fueling a titanic African war just for the sheer, unadulterated hell of it. Well, we'll come to the why in a few minutes. Before that, though, we want to outline how the world knows what the UAE is doing and how that gleaming field hospital in Amdaras fits into all of this. Now, the first thing to note is that, if proven, the act of sending weapons into Darfur would mean the UAE has violated a UN Security Council embargo put in place in 2004 and still standing today. Hence the field hospital. While plenty of the UAE's closest allies, such as the United States, might object to gun running, who could object to a hospital to treat wounded refugees? The trouble with that story is that no one wanting to treat refugees would build a hospital in Amjaras. As far back as September last year, the New York Times was pointing out that the town is a 2-day drive from the main crossing point for Sudanese fleeing into Chad. While over 400,000 had registered in Adre by that month, only 250 had registered in Amjaras. Nor would a field hospital require the level of flight traffic that this town has seen. A Sudan War Monitor has written of the 122 flights logged to the town. Open source researchers who specialize in flight tracking have doubted that so many flights would be needed for just building a field hospital. Then there's the suspicious timing of the hospital's opening. Chadian President Mahamat Idris Deby attended a meeting with UAE's leader last summer, at which the Emirates agreed to loan Chad $1.5 billion, nearly the equivalent to the Chadian government's annual budget. According to the Times, days later, Emirati cargo planes began to stream into Amjaras. More damning still is the 5-member UN panel of experts that assessed the situation in early 2024 and reported credible evidence that the UAE was delivering weapons via the hospital to RSF forces. Referencing the report, Sudan War Monitor writes that flight trackers documented the cargo flights from the UAE to the eastern Chadian town of Amjaras. From there, the local sources reported that weapons and ammunition were loaded on trucks and taken into Darfur in small convoys, where they were handed over to the RSF. Among these weapons are thought to have been everything from mortars to drones to anti-aircraft missiles. Not that the weapons shipments are the only thing Abu Dhabi stands accused of doing. The Guardian further reports that UAE medics treat wounded RSF fighters, with the hardest cases airlifted to be treated in an Abu Dhabi military hospital. UAE is also supposed to handle everything for the RSF, from business and finance to logistics and PR. Again, we need to be careful here to note that Abu Dhabi denies these claims. When news of the UN report leaked, the Emirates sent a furious letter declaring their, quote, continued commitment to comply with their obligations under the arms embargo established by the Security Council. The quote ends. Still, enough anonymous officials have briefed enough Western media about the UAE's ties to Hemeti's RSF that we feel comfortable saying the consensus is that Abu Dhabi is deeply involved in the Sudan war. And if that's the case, then the next question is why? And it's here that things get a little fuzzier. American officials are reportedly amazed that the Emirates are backing Hemeti's forces so fully, especially since it's American policy to secure a ceasefire between the two sides. Given the US stations 5,000 troops in the UAE and gives Abu Dhabi preferential treatment among Gulf nations for buying weapons, you'd expect the Emirates to want to keep Washington sweet. But that assumes the UAE's number one policy is its alliance with America. Some think Abu Dhabi has its eye on a bigger prize, a string of proxies and loyalists stretching across Africa. Recent years have seen the Emirates investing heavily in regional actors. It was UAE supplying drones to Addis Ababa in 2021 that arguably turned the tide in Ethiopia's Tigray war. Since then, the Emirates have additionally funded a private palace for leader Abiy Ahmed. Money has likewise flowed into President Mahamat Deby in Chad and to warlord Khalifa Haftar in Libya. Somalia believes Abu Dhabi is also behind a scheme for Ethiopia to establish a coastal base in its breakaway region of Somaliland in return for recognition. Add in Hemeti in Sudan, and what these leaders all seem to have in common is that they create a vast zone of influence for the UAE across Africa. Such an influence-building project may be, at least in part, a happy accident. The Economist argues that Abu Dhabi is only able to get involved due to both the West and China choosing to invest substantially less in Africa. That means the UAE can become a leader for relatively little financial outlay. Accidents or not, though, that doesn't mean the stakes aren't real. Abu Dhabi is desperate to develop its presence on the Red Sea coastline and already has contracts with Sudan to build a port. Meanwhile, the Times reports that, like many Gulf countries, the Emirates sees Sudan as a potential source of food. Added to all this is the fact that if the UAE doesn't get there first, someone else will, with that someone likely being regional rival Saudi Arabia. In their piece last summer on Sudan becoming a proxy war, Foreign Policy noted that, quote, Sudan is a bridge that links the Middle East and Africa, and its abundant natural resources mean the battle for Khartoum has taken on a regional dimension. Gulf heavyweights Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates view the war as a chance to cement their hegemonic status in the Middle East. The quote ends. In this telling, UAE isn't funding Hemedti's forces as a way of gaining control over Sudan, but as a way of stopping Saudi Arabia from becoming too influential. Although often nominal allies, such as during the war in Yemen, Abu Dhabi and Riyadh often pursue policies that could damage the other. Witness the 2018 plan by the Saudis to build an oil pipeline across Oman and Yemen that would have circumnavigated UAE and, quote, undermined the UAE's key position in oil and gas transportation. In such a vast geopolitical game, it may not matter much to Abu Dhabi what the weapons it is supplying the RSF are used for. Perhaps this is especially the case given that Hemedti has long-standing links with the Emirates, having sent thousands of his fighters to help in the war in Yemen. Speaking of Hemedti, there are signs that the UAE may have picked their man as well. On July the 1st, the UN reported that the regional capital of Sinjar had fallen to the RSF. Meanwhile, the city of El Fasher in North Darfur is surrounded, with it likely only being a matter of time before the RSF conquers it. Already reports are coming in of unrestrained looting in Sinjar. Around El Fasher, credible fears of mass killing and ethnic cleansing are swirling. While the SAF are no angels, often indiscriminately shelling civilian areas, RSF victories are all too often accompanied by horrendous atrocities. It's ironic then that the Emirati hospital in Jaras claims to be treating the victims of this war, a war that many experts both within and outside of the United Nations believe is being fueled by cold and cynical calculations made in Abu Dhabi. Next on the docket, we travel to East Asia, where long-held historical animosity has finally given way to a strategic partnership. But with accusations flying that a new NATO-style alliance is on the horizon, it's time to do both a bit of debunking and also a bit of confirmation. This particular story began late last week with a trilateral set of military exercises in the East China Sea called Freedom Edge. Conducted between Japan, South Korea, and the USA, it was the first time those three nations have ever held a so-called multi-domain military exercise together. Over the 3-day course of the Freedom Edge drills, the trio of nations conducted joint naval and air drills with a few key points to focus on: internationally coordinated ballistic missile defense, anti-submarine warfare operations, regional surveillance, and improvement of the systems by which the three share their early warning data to detect missile launches. By all accounts, the exercises were a success and spoke quite positively to the three nations' push for interoperability, the practice of a country working together with its military partners to become a more cohesive combined fighting force. The American aircraft carrier, USS Theodore Roosevelt, and its complement of aircraft and guided missile destroyers got a good workout in. Japan's helicopter-carrying destroyer, Issa, and a couple of other major ships got in on the action, and a pair of South Korean destroyers and some F-16s from the country's air force made their presence known as well. When the drills were wrapped up on Saturday, June 29th, the Theodore Roosevelt bid goodbye and steamed off to the Red Sea to play whack-a-mole with the Houthis, and all three nations left Freedom Edge better for having been a part of it. There was even a little bit of gift-giving involved. On the same day as the exercise wrapped, Japan received its first US-made amphibious combat vehicles, or ACVs, the same ones used by the US Marines whenever they've got to rock up on some hostile coastline and ruin somebody's day. But no sooner had the exercises wrapped up than a regional adversary began throwing some shade. Perhaps rather predictably, the adversary in question was North Korea, upset over the considerable show of military strength in nearby waters. On Sunday, July 1st, North Korea condemned the drills, stating in part via the country's foreign ministry, we quote here, "We strongly denounce the US, Japan, and ROK for their repeated, reckless, and provocative military muscle flexing against the DPRK and other independent states in the region, and once again seriously warn of the fatal consequences to be entailed by them." Big, scary words by the boys in olive green Pyongyang, and they backed it up with action. On Monday the 2nd, North Korea launched a pair of short-range ballistic missiles to the northeast in the general direction of northern Japan. One of the missiles traveled about 600 kilometers before splashing down into the sea, while the other launched about 10 minutes afterward and got 120 kilometers before returning to Earth. Pyongyang did not outright state that the missile launch was a direct answer to the Freedom Edge exercises, and nor did it need to. The message was received loud and clear. A day later, Japan revealed that the North Koreans weren't the only ones trying to flex. Over the prior few days, no fewer than 5 Russian warships, including a destroyer and 3 corvettes, made some uncomfortably close passes by the Japanese coast, shadowed all the while by Japanese fast attack boats and surveillance aircraft. But perhaps the most substantive rebuttal offered to the Freedom Edge drills was one that came from Pyongyang on the 30th of June. That through exercises like this one, Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo had betrayed that their true intention was to develop, quote, the Asian version of NATO. NATO, of course, refers to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the 32-member-strong military alliance that joins the United States, Canada, and the vast majority of Europe in a collective security agreement to deter and defend against the Soviet Union, now modern-day Russia. By North Korea's logic, the union of American, Japanese, and South Korean military assets looks a good bit similar. North Korea alleged that the US is working to bring both Japan and South Korea closer to the actual NATO alliance, made all the clearer by news that broke before the Freedom Edge exercise that South Korea is strongly considering supplying weapons to Ukraine. Pyongyang was sure to promise an aggressive military answer in order to protect peace in the region, and restated its long-held belief that these sorts of joint military drills involving America and South Korea are proof that the two countries plan and rehearse an eventual invasion of the North. Now look, we're not focusing on this particular story to repeat and amplify North Korea, although we'll be touching on those Asia-Pacific NATO claims shortly. Instead, we'll first focus on this new trilateral partnership directly, bringing Japan, South Korea, and the United States under one strategic umbrella. It's the sort of geopolitical golden goose that only comes along once or twice in a generation, a union of old and powerful adversaries with a complicated and bitter history into a new posture of alignment. For generations, Japanese and South Korean strategic cooperation has been a near impossibility owing to their starkly differing positions and very divergent recollections of Imperial Japan's occupation of the Korean peninsula prior to 1945. Even as recently as the early 2020s, the two have bickered about everything under the sun, with seemingly little hope for rapprochement, but in the last few years, everything has changed. Partly, the two nations have shared a worry that China is rising just across the sea, and their mutual strategic ally, the United States, appears more and more like it will be at loggerheads with China for many decades to come. Partly, they've learned the same lessons as many other nations while watching the Russian invasion of Ukraine and realize that it's best to get as many firm alliances on paper during peacetime as possible in order not to be left stranded during times of war. On the 1st of June 2024, the two nations finally reached an agreement to normalize their bilateral defense ties, finally solidifying a process of realignment that started at America's Camp David last August. Japan and South Korea haven't agreed on everything, far from it. At the time of writing, the nations are quarreling over a jointly owned messaging app called Line and staring at the prospect of South Korea's current president, Yoon Suk-yeol, facing growing scandals in advance of a potentially difficult election. But both sides, as well as the United States, seem to recognize that the prospect of long-term strategic alignment is too important to lose. In June of this year, the three nations agreed to formalize their security partnership within the next few months, racing against the potential strategic disruption that may come with America's November presidential elections. Like many other nations around the world, Japan and South Korea fear that a potential second Trump administration in Washington could see their bilateral and collective ties severed or severely reduced. But per an exclusive published by Reuters this week, Republican candidate Donald Trump's close allies have gone to great lengths to reassure both Japan and South Korea that even if Trump does win in November, the Biden-era strategic effort to bring the three nations closer together will continue uninterrupted. That both American presidential campaigns recognize the immense value of this continued partnership speaks to the high likelihood that it will continue on course over the next several years at a minimum. So, with such intense diplomatic focus on America, Japan, and South Korea's trilateral security ties, it's time to revisit that prospect that Pyongyang brought up, that the current situation might evolve into, as North Korea put it, the Asian version of NATO. Of course, it's a time-tested rule of geopolitics that if you ever find yourself saying, "I agree with North Korea," you're probably on the wrong side of history. And we've got to be clear here. There is zero indicator that Japan, South Korea, and the United States intend to ever enshrine their trilateral partnership into a NATO-like military alliance. Not only is this close collaboration between South Korea and Japan a very new phenomenon, so new in fact that it's not really worth being confident yet that it'll even hold up for the next few years, but it's also many orders of magnitude short of the alliance NATO has become. Put simply, creating that sort of treaty organization is a messy, bureaucratic, and also quite loud process, one that would be very difficult to ignore if it were to begin. And it's critical to understand that for military alliances, NATO and beyond, a large part of the reason that they work so well is that they're not kept a secret. If, to draw on an example from elsewhere in recent global affairs, the small nation of Guyana wants to help in fending off a potential invasion from Venezuela, it might go to Brazil and ask for a defensive alliance. But if it keeps such an alliance secret, it'll only be useful if Venezuela actually invades. announce a partnership publicly beforehand, and when Venezuela thinks about whether it can defeat Guyana, it's got to think about whether it can defeat Brazil. And since it can't, that aforementioned invasion of Guyana becomes far less likely. In the Far East, it would make similarly little sense for the US, South Korea, and Japan to form an Asia-Pacific NATO without making their alliance abundantly clear to North Korea, China, Russia, and anyone else that the alliance is meant to deter. So, we've checked the box. We aren't agreeing with North Korea. We're on the right side of history, at least for the time being. But we've also got to emphasize that while the label of Asia-Pacific NATO is misplaced, there's still something going on that, dare we say, North Korea isn't wrong to notice. These three Asia-Pacific nations, the US, Japan, and South Korea, are absolutely enshrining their strategic cooperation for the long term, and they're certainly not doing it without reason. Seoul and Tokyo have the two largest militaries of any US ally in East Asia. They combine to host some 80,000 American troops on their soil, and they share common military equipment, common tactics, and a common strategic focus. Moreover, they are advertising their newly strengthened alignment to Russia, China, North Korea, and all the rest, not as the new Asia-Pacific NATO, but as a force to reckon with. But the part missing from that story isn't the far greater secret collusion that Pyongyang alleges. It's that stopping at these three nations alone isn't casting a wide enough net. While Washington may not be consecrating an Asia-Pacific NATO anytime soon, there's a very real argument to make that the US, with Japan and especially South Korea's help, are working toward a broader network of strategic alliances in the region that go far beyond just these three power players. Relying partly on trade, partly on defense cooperation and bilateral security, partly on intelligence sharing, and partly on weapons exports, the generally America-friendly, generally China-opposed or China-hesitant nations of the Pacific are moving toward major cooperation. But while NATO is a loud, unmissable treaty, strong in its rhetoric but potentially fragile when it comes to its member nations' willingness to commit, this new set of partnerships is the opposite. Averse to grandiosity and interreliant not because of bluster, but because of the real political interests of each participating nation, which are served more by working together on defense than by breaking apart. The linchpin of it all is South Korea's booming military-industrial complex, a new powerhouse that can offer highly formidable weapon systems of all kinds for lower cost and with higher interoperability than most of what's on the market, and without all the pesky export controls of the United States. In 2023, South Korea gave the Philippines the first of 10 warships, including its first ever missile frigates. It's spent years furnishing fighter aircraft to not just the Philippines, but to Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And its new, highly advanced fourth-generation Boramae fighter jet will go on the market very soon. In Thailand, defense interests go far past planes to naval frigates and potential collaboration on arms manufacturing. It's building infantry fighting vehicles for Australia in one of Canberra's biggest military expenditures ever. It's doing massive business with Poland, a NATO member nation and emerging defense powerhouse in Europe. And it's reportedly close to joining AUKUS, the intelligence-sharing partnership between the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Even Vietnam, historically reticent to accept non-Soviet or non-Russian weaponry, is looking toward major acquisitions from South Korea. And far beyond South Korea, movement in and around the Asia-Pacific has seen the nations of the region draw closer to each other in a cohesive defense posture, year after year. Japan has worked to elevate its security ties with Taiwan and is making a strong case that it should join the Five Eyes intelligence network, which includes the US and two Pacific nations, along with the UK and Canada. The Philippines have drawn increasing defense support from the US and plan a major military overhaul in the next decade, while Vietnam just recently elevated its security relationship with America to a, quote, comprehensive strategic partnership. In May of this year, Australia unveiled its biggest defense budget ever, with the goal of doubling its fleet of warships, while in February it announced that it and Indonesia intend to sign a major defense pact in the coming months. And while each nation in the region continues to publicly hold Taiwan at arm's length, increasing reports from a number of Asia-Pacific countries indicate that their hesitance to commit to Taiwan's defense are less and less a matter of appeasing China and more a strategy of strategic ambiguity to force China to reckon with uncertainty about the prospect of a Taiwan invasion. In a somewhat less ambiguous turn of events, American troops have even been hinted at maintaining a presence on Taiwan's outlying islands near the Chinese mainland. Now, it's premature to discuss whether an Asia-Pacific NATO would ever be a good idea in the future, because, as of now, any overt, region-wide cooperation on that level is still a long way off. But draw a line around the Asia-Pacific from Japan to South Korea to Taiwan and the Philippines, as well as Australia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand, And you've just drawn a line around China and North Korea. And while none of those nations seem willing to commit to a treaty of mutual defense, they all share a common backer in the United States, and they're being woven together by an increasingly thickened network of treaties, arms deals, partnerships, and just about every other defense-orientated sort of bond that countries could share. It's not a Cold War-style alliance of collective defense, and it won't be, at least not anytime soon. But look further back than the Cold War to the patchwork of alliances every which way that preceded World War I, and the current situation in Asia-Pacific starts to look a little bit more familiar. Even for people like us who make a living talking about conflict, the two Liberian civil wars stand out for their sheer awfulness. Taking place between 1989 and 2003, the conflicts saw rebel groups largely split along ethnic lines battling for power. 250,000 were killed, accounting for about 8% of the Liberian population. So widespread was the destruction that over half the population were forced to flee their homes. Yet it's not the numbers, grim as they are, that make Liberia's 14 years of conflict so hard to stomach. Rather, it's the grotesque, almost carnivalesque atmosphere that surrounded all the killing. This was an era in which a man known as General Butt Naked could rise to fame, who fed children mind-bending drugs, gave them rifles, and sent them into battle entirely nude. It was a time in which warlords engaged in acts of ritual cannibalism, in which soldiers carried out child sacrifices before battle to ensure the gods were smiling on them. In short, it was an atrocity exhibition, one so excessive and gory that it almost makes today's conflicts look like models of gentlemanly conduct. And yet, for all the horrors Liberia's meltdown inflicted, almost no one has ever faced justice. General Butt Naked, for example, is today a free man working as an evangelical preacher. Warlord Prince Johnson, who had himself videotaped overseeing the mutilation and murder of the deposed president Samuel Doe, while he's now a powerful senator. Those who did face justice, meanwhile, were largely persecuted for crimes committed outside Liberia. Most famously, this includes warlord-turned-president Charles Taylor, jailed for atrocities he unleashed in neighbouring Sierra Leone. But it also includes Mohamed Jabatar, a man who cut a baby out of a pregnant woman's stomach, yet he was jailed in the US for immigration fraud. That makes Liberia something of an outlier among 1990s conflicts, while Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone all saw dedicated criminal tribunals. Liberia instead saw a government comprised of the warlords who'd torn it apart. As Al Jazeera explains, at the end of the civil wars, slots in Liberia's interim government were divided among warring factions who inserted their members or proxies in these positions. Closest the country ever got to an accounting of crimes was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, better known as the TRC. Set up by post-war President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in 2006, the TRC put forward its recommendations 3 years later. These included not just establishing a war crimes court for trying people like Prince Johnson, but also disbarring from office anyone connected to any of the warlords. Awkwardly, their list of people to disbar included powerful lawmakers, and even Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who'd once, as Reuters reports, donated money to Charles Taylor. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the political class failed to implement the TRC's recommendations, and so on it went. A culture of impunity in Liberia that has managed to last until this very day. Although, it might not last much longer. Back in May, President Joseph Boakai signed an executive order to establish a war crime court for Liberia. Remarkably, lawmakers in both the Parliament and the Senate backed him, with even former warlords like Prince Johnson voting the bill through. Now the government is slowly starting to put in place the people and the mechanisms to make the president's order a reality. All of which means that after 2 decades of utter impunity, Liberia's war criminals may finally face something like justice. And to be frank, our position is that justice cannot come soon enough. As AP News describes it, Liberia's 2 civil wars were characterized by widespread mass killings, torture, and sexual violence. Kicking off when Charles Taylor led a 1989 rebellion against President Samuel Doe, who'd himself taken power in a coup, the fighting reduced the nation to rubble. Infrastructure was destroyed, the economy bottomed out, the capital, Monrovia, became a pockmarked wreck. By 1991, Charles Taylor's forces had invaded Sierra Leone, sparking a parallel civil war across the border. To Despite a brief respite in 1997 following a peace deal that saw Taylor become president, the bloodshed restarted in 1999 and didn't end until 2003 when the warlord at last fled into exile. While over 20 years have passed since then, the effects of the war are still only too obvious in Liberia. According to The Telegraph, the nation today is one of the world's 10 poorest, with half of all people living in poverty. Barely a quarter of the population of 5.3 million has access to electricity. Then there's the heavy drug use. During the conflict, warlords recruited child soldiers as young as 9 or 10 and fed them drugs before sending them out to fight. Today, those former kids are addicts in their late 20s, and many hooked on a fentanyl-based narcotic known as Kush. Roughly 20% of the population today uses such drugs. Perhaps the biggest after effect, though, is how elite Liberian society remains structured around the various groups that fought in the two wars. Now, we talked earlier about how powerful members of the Senate and Parliament stand accused of crimes like rape and torture. What we didn't mention is that Liberia's political system makes it hard to remove them from power. Because politicians need an absolute majority of votes to become president, those seeking the job are forced to make alliances with powerful elites who can help them to the top. Since these elites are often former rebels or warlords, anyone who gets into a position to remake Liberian society is disincentivized from doing so. And it's here that we get onto what is perhaps the most salient question about the new War Crimes Tribunal. Is there any chance that it will ever work? Now, if that question sounds a little unfair, it only reflects a feeling that Liberia's war-forged elite will find a way to escape justice. AFP reports that controversy has already been generated by the president naming a lawyer to head the court who was previously best known for defending Charles Taylor's wife against war crimes accusations. Then there are the motivations of those involved. Although Prince Johnson voted for the court to be set up, he now rails against it as a conspiracy and not so subtly threatens to unleash violence should he be indicted. Unfortunately, his threats carry some weight. Because Liberia's wars were mostly fought along ethnic lines, a lot of scope remains for guys like Johnson to stoke the fires of ethnic hatred. If people come to believe the new court is biased against their kin, it could be destabilizing for the whole of society. All of which may be why some would prefer it if the tribunal never went ahead. Speaking to Al Jazeera, civil society leader Khan Mani-Wassa, who was involved in drafting the 2003 peace agreement, lamented that prosecutions could see the security situation deteriorate. Quoting here, "Whatever we do that could lead to war, we should reject. We made compromises for this peace. We must not do anything to reverse these gains." Instead of investing in a war crimes court, Wassa argues that the money should be spent on improving hospitals and making sure Liberians have access to employment. Still, no matter what the practicalities might be, it's hard not to feel that the time may have come to prosecute Liberia's war criminals, to make sure that those who subjected this nation to 14 years of horror at last stand trial. After all, the list of crimes for which no one has ever been punished is long. There's the massacre at the Lutheran church in Monrovia, where 600 people seeking shelter were hacked to death in 1990. There's the rape and mutilation of tens of thousands of women and girls. The childhoods torn apart as kids as young as 6 were given guns and sent off to kill. It's stuff like this that preacher Joshua Milton Blahyi claims weighs on his mind. A huge supporter of the tribunal, the Christian Blahyi has railed against Liberia being a state of impunity despite his own criminal background. By his own admission, Blahyi has killed 20,000 people. We've already met him a couple of times in this chapter. Before he became Joshua Milton Blahyi, the preacher was best known under the name General Butt Naked. Now he claims to have found religion and tells reporters that if going to jail will send a message that no matter how powerful you are, the law is more powerful than you, then I am ready to go to jail. If the precedent is set that General Butt Naked killed people and ended up in jail, then that would be a good precedent. Is that just a self-serving lie, a way for a psychopathic killer to present himself as an angel to the foreign press? Well, yeah, sure, maybe. But it's also, for better or worse, a message that carries a painful truth that for all the worries it could reignite the chaos, justice demands that Liberia's warlords face up to their actions in court. As for whether the tribunal established by President Joseph Boakai can pull off this difficult feat, well, that's something that remains to be seen. And finally, we're going to address a trio of stories worth mentioning this week, including one from Myanmar and 2 from Ukraine. First up, we travel to the Donbass, where Russian and Ukrainian soldiers are locked into a cycle of bitter trench warfare, fighting tooth and nail for tactical victories of just a few hundred meters at a time. But amidst the hail of bullets and artillery shells has come a new and unconventional addition that spread up and down the Russian front. It's a bit of a strange image. Russian infantrymen riding en masse on motorcycles in the modern-day version of a cavalry charge, all but completely unarmored as a hail of Ukrainian bullets attempts to stop them. But strange or not, it's precisely the approach that Russia has chosen. Quoting the New York Times here, Russian soldiers riding motorcycles, dirt bikes, quadricycles, and dune buggies now account for about half of all attacks in some areas of the front, soldiers and commanders say, as Moscow's forces attempt to use speed to cross exposed open spaces where its lumbering armored vehicles are easy targets. Quote ends. The vehicles in question are Moscow's answer to a battlefield that mixes World War I-style trenches with cutting-edge technology. On the one hand, Russian heavy armored attacks have proven more trouble than they're worth, targeted by highly efficient Ukrainian kamikaze drones, rocket-propelled grenades, and buried mines that can turn tanks and troop carriers into twisted metal before they ever reach the trenches they're attacking. On the other, the constant presence of surveillance drones on both sides means that Ukraine knows full well when Russian infantry are massing to try and break through. The motorcycle cavalry, however, helps to solve both problems at once. Light, nimble, and narrow, they're hard to hit with anti-armor weapons and can even pass right over some of the less sensitive mines on the battlefield, but since they can mass far from the front lines, drive a few kilometers, and race out into no man's land, they're also far harder to predict. In a long, slow Russian advance, where the nation's best strategic victory in the last few months has been to advance some 10, maybe 15 miles in a few areas, death-defying infantrymen on dirt bikes have proven able to shake things up. But while the new tactic must be something to behold, especially from the Ukrainian side, it also comes with some fairly major drawbacks. Motorcycle swarms are a high-casualty affair, with Russian troops virtually unprotected, sitting high on their mounts and vulnerable to raking small arms fire, especially from the machine guns that litter the front lines on both sides. At the same time, human soldiers aren't the only casualty that Russia has to worry about. The motorcycles, too, are a finite resource, and they're all but impossible to recover if a rider is shot off of them in no man's land, unless that same forward charge ends up being successful. When it comes to pre-war planning, asking questions around how many shells, tanks, or fighter jets Russia had before the Ukraine invasion began was the priority. Asking how many motorcycles Russia could field wasn't. So it's difficult to say whether Russia is close to depleting its stock. But it's also hard to imagine that Russian dirt bikes are an unlimited resource, even though they'd probably be great to ride through the Siberian wastelands. It's unlikely that such a tactic can last for long, so using them to create short-term success against Ukraine will be all the more important. As for whether that success has been forthcoming, the answer's, well, sometimes. For Russia, motorcycle cavalry charges are one half of their newest trench-taking approach. First, heavy artillery bombardments kick off, forcing Ukrainian soldiers to take shelter and avoid the positions by which they might see out into no man's land. In an ideal world, those soldiers might not realize the motorcycle advance is coming until a roar like a million buzzing bees becomes enough to drown out the explosion of artillery shells. By that time, of course, the motorcycles are on top of them. Even if Ukraine's soldiers see the advance, the hail of artillery fire makes it harder to fight back in time. Once the Russians get close enough, they dismount their bikes and leave them behind, jumping down into the trenches with shotguns, rifles, and all manner of killing implements for close-quarters combat. If all goes well for the Russian bikers, they might even force a retreat from the trenches, but most of the time these tactics still make Russia pay with high casualties. But they're backed by another recent Russian arrival, a second wave attacker that can turn a trench battle in Russia's favor after the mounted infantry advance has gone well. That new addition is the Turtle tank, ridiculously heavy armored tanks welded into a protective box of sheet metal armor. Roughly the size of a small horse and described by one Ukrainian tank operator interviewed by Forbes as, quote, blind, loud, and stupid, the Turtle tanks are, if we're being kind, a brute force implement. Using rollers to explode mines and well shielded against the kamikaze drones that Ukraine typically uses to take out Russian heavy armor, these Turtle tanks have shown up in increasing numbers across the front lines. But deprived of nearly all visibility and unable to even turn or shoot the main gun because of the box armor, they're not particularly useful on their own. Instead, they roll in behind these fast Russian attacks in hopes that they'll turn the tide decisively during trench skirmishes. In best-case scenarios, they might bulldoze sections of Ukrainian defenders, and even if they and a first motorcycle assault fail, they leave behind paths cleared of mines, and a subsequent Russian assault can use that to bring in heavy armor that would otherwise be exposed. It's not a pretty set of tactics by any means, but it's the closest Russia has come to getting these front lines unstuck. Also, as part of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we travel a few hundred kilometers to Kyiv, where the Security Service of Ukraine, or SBU, has claimed that it stopped an attempted coup that it claims could have toppled the Ukrainian government. The news dropped just ahead of a scheduled visit between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, a prominent NATO member who nonetheless maintains strong ties with Moscow. Per the Ukrainian SBU, the attempted coup risked turning the situation in Ukraine decisively to Russia's advantage. According to the SBU, per a Telegram post released on Monday, the 1st of July, a group of conspirators were making plans within Ukraine to provoke a riot within the country. The conspirators have not yet been named, and they may not be. But at least one, per the SBU, was a co-founder of an unidentified public organization that the SBU has accused of anti-Ukrainian actions since 2015. The conspirators' plan would have been organized into several steps. First, they would have organized a rally in the city center of the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv on the 30th of June, the day before the alleged plot came to light. At that rally, the conspirators would have sparked a riot among peaceful protesters who wouldn't have known about the plot, but would have hopefully gathered on the order of several thousand attendees. By disseminating information about unrest in Kyiv, relying on both Ukrainian and foreign sources of information, the conspirators allegedly hoped to provoke outrage in the crowd, which they'd reinforce by announcing their desire to remove Ukraine's current leaders from power. Using the power and passion of the crowd, the conspirators would have moved into the Ukrainian parliament building, seizing it and replacing the nation's civilian and military governments. It's a vague plan, especially considering that the 4 people Ukraine has allegedly arrested for the plot have yet to be identified, and it's unclear just how successful it would have or even could have been. Per Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General, an office not directly affiliated with the SBU, the conspirators attempted to solicit support from members of the Ukrainian military as well as from private security guards within the country. The conspirators also are alleged to have rented a hall inside Kyiv with capacity for some 2,000 people, although the purpose of such an act is, as yet, unclear considering how the purported rally was supposed to happen in the city centre. But even still, such a highly ambitious plan does not seem particularly likely to succeed, owing in large part to the fact that storming Ukraine's parliament and other heavily guarded government buildings is not an easy task in wartime. But making matters even more complicated, much of Ukraine's civil and military leadership would likely not have been present to be overthrown. In a last installment of the Situation Room, we discussed another purported plot to destabilize Ukraine, this one relying on 2 colonels of Ukraine's state guard who would have attempted to assassinate President Zelensky and other top Ukrainian figures. As we explained then, Zelensky's movements, as well as the movements of his top allies and deputies, are kept hidden from both the public and the vast majority of the international community. When he shows up in a Ukrainian city to do business or give an address, his presence is only reported after he's gone, and when he does interviews or holds a surprise local event, reports of his presence are embargoed until he's left. On the one hand, if this new alleged plot used some inside information indicating that Zelensky or other prominent Ukrainians would be in the national parliament or even in Kyiv during the time when the rally was planned, then it may have indeed posed a major national security concern. But if it didn't, then it's unlikely that even a successful parliamentary takeover would have led to the toppling of the Ukrainian government without other substantial developments after that. Perhaps tacitly endorsing the idea that the attempt didn't constitute a mortal threat to Ukraine, the SBU has focused, after the fact, on the idea that such an attempted coup should be a reminder of Russia's determination to take down the Zelensky government rather than emphasizing any greater imminent threat. And last of all, we travel to Myanmar, where the ruling military junta's stunning loss of territory in the last few months seems to have led to some fairly intense fears of unrest in the areas that the junta still controls. Rather than focusing on the regions under the control of the Three Brotherhood Alliance or any of Myanmar's other resistance organizations, we're going to zoom in on the city of Mandalay, where the junta is still very much in control. Over the last several weeks, soldiers and police officers in Mandalay have arrested no fewer than 10 business owners, not for fomenting unrest, propagating dissent, or helping the resistance, but for giving their employees raises. Now, there's no good reason that some shop owner in Mandalay deciding to pay their workers a little better should be a wartime threat to the junta, but the links between these small, generous acts and the junta's crumbling support on the home front are, from the military's perspective, deeply intertwined. The issue at hand is inflation, which is, in Myanmar, absolutely exploding. According to the World Bank, Myanmar's annual inflation as of March 2024 was at over 20%, and since then the situation has only gotten worse. Myanmar's currency, the kyat, has tanked as well, losing some 40% of its value in the last 2 months. And while it's not illegal in Myanmar, at least not yet, for a business owner to increase their workers' pay, the military junta appears convinced that if owners do raise pay, then people will start catching on to the idea that inflation is bad and getting worse. Forget skyrocketing prices or diminished value of people's life savings, it's the business owners giving raises that are going to expose the junta's secret. Each business owner arrested so far faces 3 years in prison. Each has been charged with undermining the regime by, as a legal expert paraphrased it in the New York Times, making people believe that inflation is rising. While it's highly unlikely that the arrest of the few business owners will be the straw that breaks the Burmese public's back, it's the most striking in a line of recent indicators that the junta's fears of popular unrest are at an all-time high. As of now, Myanmar's many rebel organizations control well over half the country. They've secured border crossings and established relations with neighboring countries, and they're winning on the battlefield to the point that they're now taking out army bases and provincial capitals. The junta has been forced to hole up, relying predominantly on Myanmar's largest cities and the military's own largest and most well-fortified bases. As of now, the resistance would face an uphill battle to kick the junta out of those places, but add in popular revolts, even from within the cities, and that calculus changes. In the cities, food is more expensive than it's ever been, owing largely to the junta's own decision to destroy villages and critical rice fields in earlier phases of the war. Electricity is available in most of the country for 4 hours a day or less, even though temperatures regularly crest over 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 Celsius. Internally displaced people have flooded into the cities, imports have dried up, Western sanctions have the economy crumbling, and the military's own attempts to impose a draft have caused legions of young men and women to flee the cities and even the country. At this moment, Myanmar cities are defended well enough, but what the junta is defending is a powder keg. And if the idea that a business owner giving out raises is worthy of years of imprisonment, then that powder keg has come critically close to its final detonation. Thanks for watching.